What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to Josh's Sports Report. It's been a little while since we've done an episode, but we have got a great one for you today. We've got Erik Slater coming on the show, a beat reporter covering the Brooklyn Nets for Clutch Points, and the host of the Believe in Nets podcast. Let's hit the intro and get it going. Erik, thanks so much for joining us on the show. How you doing?
I'm doing very well, man. I'm excited to come on here and talk some Nets hoops with you.
Absolutely. I feel like this is the peak of Nets fandom period. We get to dream up our perfect draft day scenario, talk a little bit about free agency. But the biggest elephant in the room right now in Brooklyn, Giannis, hasn't requested a trade, but he says his options are open outside of the Bucks. First time in his career that's the case. Is there any chance Brooklyn seriously pursues him?
I definitely think there's a chance. I don't think you can rule anything out. I think when you look at the landscape of what's going to be Giannis's potential options, I think the Nets are definitely a team that could be firmly in the mix if they want to, because they have, following that Mikal Bridges trade last summer, they have an NBA best 15 first round picks over the next 7 years. 10 of those are tradable. They have a lot of cap space. I think this playoffs have shown that the Western Conference is going to be a little bit of a gauntlet moving forward. So if Giannis is looking for opportunities, his best paths to go to the finals, in other situations, I think the Eastern Conference makes a lot more sense in that regard. And I think the Nets, if you're looking at the teams that could be possibilities, have the most assets of those to pull off a deal. So I think they definitely can be in the mix. I think it's really going to come down to whether they want to be in a mix, whether they think, the price, what it takes, if they feel what they need to give up is worth it, and whether they feel that they can feel the roster around him that gives them a legitimate chance in this Eastern Conference. So I definitely wouldn't rule it out.
Right. And if they were to go after Giannis, that would be the third time Brooklyn would dive headfirst into a superstar situation in the Brooklyn era. The first two times certainly have not worked out well. If they do get Giannis, I mean, we're going to need some change at that point. That would be big. But what do you think a realistic deal would be like for that? You mentioned the Mikal Bridges trade. The Nets are beyond stockpiled with picks, and they have a couple assets that Milwaukee could be looking for. What do you think would be a good deal for the Nets if they were
Yeah.
to bring in Giannis?
Yeah, I think it's tough. It's tough at this point to put an exact package, but I think that's something that's clear if the Nets were to get in the mix, is that their package would be more pick oriented, draft pick oriented, as opposed to players. Some of the other teams that might be in the mix for Giannis, whoever you want to say, most of them have a young player who has all-star potential, either has been an all-star, could potentially get there. So they have those guys who could headline a package, which I think the Bucks will likely be looking for, because they don't own any of their first round picks or any draft picks really until 2031. So they're not able to go into a tank. So because of that, with the Nets lacking that star level centerpiece player, they would just have to overwhelm them with picks. Another scenario beyond that could be the Nets looking to get involved with the teams that own the Bucks picks moving forward, which is the New Orleans Pelicans for the next few years. And then beyond that, the Portland Trailblazers have a couple of their picks. So if the Nets could look to try to get those picks, involve those teams as a third team in a deal, get the Bucks' picks, give them those picks back, allow them to go into a tank and work a 3-team trade that works out for all parties in that way, that seems feasible. But I think the package, if you're looking for what the Nets you're going to have to give up, you can't say exactly, but for a player of Giannis's caliber, 30 years old, top 3-4 player in the NBA right now, if it's going to be pick oriented, you're looking probably at 5+ first round picks, swaps, a few salary fillers, things along those lines. So I think that would be the framework of a package if they're just trying to overwhelm, or they could use some of those picks and other assets to try to get the third team involved, whether it be the Pelicans or the Trailblazers, who have control of the Bucks picks, let the Bucks get their picks back and then go into a proper tank. So I think, the only thing you can say right now is, for the Nets' potential offer, if they do get involved, is that it's going to involve a whole lot of draft picks.
Yeah, it would be a absolute haul to get Giannis in the building in Brooklyn, and maybe getting a third team involved is the best way to do it. But another draft asset that would be Brooklyn shipping out a player that I want to talk about is Cam Johnson. He was an interesting situation for me at the deadline. I thought that he might have been dealt because the Nets really were no interest to win basketball games at that point. Ends up staying in Brooklyn. Could he be shipped off for draft assets soon?
It's definitely a possibility. I don't think you can rule anything out. I think when you look at a lot of the scenarios that have been floated, the Nets have the 8th pick, 19th pick, 26, 27 in the first round. A lot of people have been asking, could they move up from 8? Could they move up from 19 and maneuver and kind of consolidate some of those assets? I think Cam has been Cam Johnson, a player that's been floated in a lot of those scenarios as a guy that they could package with picks to try to move up into the draft, whether that be into the top 3 or into the late lottery from 19. I definitely think it's possible. I also know that the Nets really like Cam Johnson. They're going to be bringing in a number of rookies this coming season, and I know that they value what he brings to the table from a leadership standpoint, as a veteran guy who kind of knows how to, go about the day-to-day, be an NBA pro. And I think they value that with the amount of rookies that they're about to bring in. I asked general manager Sean Marks about this at his exit interview, and he said that Cam embodies a lot of the things that the Nets want to be about, and that they're not in a rush to trade players like that. So it's clear that they like Cam. It's clear that he could play an important role as a veteran mentor to these rookies they're bringing in. It's also clear if they are to go for a player like Giannis or potentially another star down the line, he's a guy I think they would want to have around. So having him kind of gives them the ability to have a piece in house that could be paired with one of those stars. So it gives kind of both paths open. It also could potentially, he could also, as I said, be the guy who helps them move up or fetches them a return coming off a career season that he just had last year. So I definitely don't think it's out of the question that Cam could be traded, but I think it's going to take a lot because I do know that the Nets front office, Nets coaching staff, and a lot of Cam's teammates are very, very high on what he brings to the table.
Yeah, he's extremely interesting. I think the Nets could go basically any which way with Cam in it. And it's interesting that they do want to keep him around for leadership reasons because this Nets team was extremely young this year with a lot of inexperienced guys. So maybe Cam Johnson could help out on that front. Free agency wise, this is something I really wanted to pick your brain on. Nets have a lot of free agencies heading into this offseason in a couple different spots, whether that be restricted, unrestricted, or a couple of guys who they have an option to pick up. But I think the biggest headline would be Cam Thomas, restricted free agent coming in here. I feel like the obvious move would be to re-sign him. I don't think of a scenario where they can. He feels like Brooklyn's future at this point. But is there any chance they don't? And if they do, will this be one of those modern day mega deals?
Yeah, I think when you look at Cam's situation, I think it's very likely that he's back with the Nets this year because if you look at the cap space landscape around the NBA right now, there's only really one team that has cap space this year, significant cap space, and that's the Nets. So if you're in Cam Thomas's situation and you're looking for, other teams, other offers outside of the Nets, there isn't really a team that's projected to have cap space. Because of that, a lot of the league is going to be limited to the non-taxpayer mid-level exception, which is around $14-15 million. That would be the most they can offer Cam. I think he'll get more than that from the Nets. And, in regard to what the contract could look like, the Nets aren't really in a position where they have to pay Cam, a max level, huge star level contract because no other teams have cap space. So, I think they'll still give Cam what they feel that he's worth, which, could be up near or above $20 million a year. But I think it might be a shorter term deal where, there's still a lot of questions, obviously, about Cam as a player, about, what his role is going to be in the NBA moving forward. So I think you could be looking at a shorter term deal where Cam gets some money and then the Nets are using that, short-term contract to further evaluate him and decide whether he's going to be, a long-term piece for them moving forward. Because we thought maybe a lot of those questions would be answered this past season, but Cam obviously only played 25 games. He had 3 hamstring injuries. So the jury's very much still out. There's a lot of questions about Cam, and I think the Nets will get him back on a reasonable short-term deal and, use that to further evaluate and see what they have in him moving forward.
Injury concerns continue to linger for him. I'm surprised that we're not thinking lock him up long term and just protect him from hitting the market as an unrestricted free agent. But it sounds like you want to go
Yeah,
short term, couple years, and see what he can do as he approaches his prime.
yeah, that's I mean, the long-term deal has been floated by some people. It's definitely a possibility, but I think, at the number that the Nets are going to be able to get Cam on because there are no other teams with cap space, it depends on what Cam wants, but it might not be in Cam's best interest, or he might not want to lock himself into a long-term deal because he doesn't really have anybody else to kind of leverage the Nets into a bigger offer. There's not going to be a bidding war for him. There's not a lot out there in terms of cap space. So by locking himself into a long-term deal, he could be cutting himself short. So I think, his representation probably going to push for a shorter term deal. I would think that would allow him to re-enter free agency when some more teams might have some cap space and he might have the ability to kind of get a bigger contract not too far down the line.
Great point. Gives himself an opportunity to play for what he believes he's worth. But outside of Cam Thomas, the star of this team, there's a lot of key contributors from last year's squad: D'Angelo Russell, Zaire Williams, Trendon Watford, set to hit the market, who did play a role on this team last year. But if the identity's shifting, if the tank is not so much lose every possible game, and that's the mentality, D'Lo, Zaire, Trendon Watford, those are three big names that I think hinge what the Nets are going to try and do this year.
Yeah, I definitely think that those guys all, played important roles for the Nets this season. And I definitely think that all of them, have a case to be back. I think that D'Angelo is a little bit of a different situation than Zaire and Trendon just because of his age. He's obviously much older than those guys, going on
Right.
29 years old, I think. Zaire and Trendon around 23 years old. So I think Zaire and Trendon can be back on reasonable, not much higher than the minimum contracts. I would think
Yep.
D'Angelo's a little bit of a different story. He's going to get more money than that, you would think. And the Nets also, if they are, going into another season where they're prioritizing draft position and tanking, bringing in these rookies, it might not necessarily make sense for them to bring D'Angelo back, where he's a guy that could raise their floor and help them win some more games than they want to be, which, was the case at the beginning of this season with somebody like Dennis Schroeder playing point guard. The quickest way to, kind of handicap a team is to take away their ball handling ability, to remove a high level, high floor lead ball handler. And I think D'Angelo, while he has his shortcomings, he's shown that he can do those kinds of things for a team. So he definitely could be back. I think it depends on what kind of direction they're going. But if it is another year where they're prioritizing draft position and potentially tanking, they might have that one veteran in Cam Johnson who's already been in the building for a little bit and they, feel comfortable with in that role. It might not make sense to bring another guy in D'Angelo Russell who could potentially help them win some more games. The case where it could make some sense is maybe if they sign him and then have his contract on the books to be able to trade later. That could make some sense. So I definitely think that he has a case to be back, but I'd be much more confident in Zaire Williams and potentially Trendon Watford being re-signed.
I agree. D'Angelo Russell, remember, the Nets didn't bring him in here to win games. He was sort of a side effect, you could say, of sending Finney Smith over to the Lakers. So you brought him in here, and then obviously his 1 year has expired. I think that is a really intriguing position to be in for the Nets if you want to sign him. And basically, what you'd be banking on there is him playing 20 games of his highest potential and then getting a big time return. But then you'd have to convince him not to take much guaranteed money, and that could bring up some salary issues. And then a couple of guys, lower end, but still pivotal roles, couple 3-and-D guys, a couple big culture guys towards the end of the season at least. Keon Johnson, Jalen Wilson, Tyrese Martin, and then Drew Timme playing the final 15 games for the Nets. Who of this group do you think the Nets are headed towards? Who will they let walk? Obviously, not much in the way of spending too much money on these guys. The Nets have $55 million in cap space to spread around, so they're not exactly tight with money at this point. Could all four possibly be coming back?
I think it's a possibility. I think it might be tough with the amount of rookies that they're bringing in, some, roster spots that they might need to have in, for trades with guys coming in, whether they take on some salary dumps or if they even sign some free agents. So I'd be surprised if all four of those guys were back, but I definitely think that there's a case For a few of them to be back, I think Keon Johnson showed some things that he can do. While he still has his shortcomings, obviously, as an outside shooter in some things. I know the Nets were happy with what he was able to show last season in a really expanded role, the biggest role that he's had in his NBA career. I think Tyrese Martin had some really impressive stretches for the Nets
Yep.
that, converted him to that standard contract. And I think they'd like to see what they have in him. He's obviously a little bit of an older guy, going to be 26 this season, but I think showed some impressive things that he can do, with some shooting performances and also as a secondary ball handler, a secondary shot creator. So I definitely think there's a shot that he could be back. Drew Timme obviously did some impressive things at the end of the season. I do think, it might be an uphill battle for him to secure a roster spot with Nick Claxton there, with Day'Ron Sharpe potentially coming back, and also with the Nets having 5 draft picks within the top 36. We'll see how many of those they actually end up making, but it might be tough, for him to secure a roster spot given all that they have, potentially coming in this offseason. But he could be a guy who's back on a 2-way contract. He could be a guy who's still in the mix. But I think that, he was able to show some intriguing stuff at the end of the season, but the Nets are just going to have a lot of young talent coming in. So there's going to be a lot of, fighting for those final few roster spots.
The meat of the offseason, the NBA draft, the moment I've been waiting to talk to you about. I think this is the biggest draft, definitely of my lifetime for the Nets. Obviously, the lottery didn't work out. The hopes at the beginning of the year were tank for Cooper Flag. They end up in the 8th position, unlucky, a couple spots back of where they were projected to be heading into the lottery. But hey, who knows at this point? Dallas ends up winning it with like a 1% chance. Lottery's ridiculous at this point. I think you touched on this a little earlier in the show, but I really want to go in depth about the possibility of trading into the top 3. Nets have 5 draft picks early in this draft. Could they package those up? He put out an article recently for Clutch Points about San Antonio and Philadelphia, who are slotted right now at 2 and 3, being possible trade candidates. Could the Nets somehow end up in the top 3 on draft night?
I think if we're talking about the number 2 spot with the San Antonio Spurs, I was in the draft. I was at the draft combine in Chicago. There was a lot of chatter about what direction do the Spurs go with that pick, because they have a lot of possibilities there. They could potentially package that pick to try to make a swing for a guy like Giannis. They could stand pat. They could pick Dylan Harper and pair him with Victor Wembanyama and De'Aaron Fox. They could pick Dylan Harper and then trade De'Aaron Fox and just roll with a younger core of Wembanyama, Stephon Castle, Dylan Harper. I think if you're looking from the Nets perspective of trying to move from number 8 to number 2, that's going to take a lot, because this is really seen as a draft where there's 2 clear-cut top players in it. Obviously, Cooper Flag at number 1, Dylan Harper is the consensus number 2 pick. And while there's a ton of great players after that, there's a little bit of a gap between what is, Dylan at 2 and the next player, whether that be Ace Bailey, VJ Edgecombe, whoever you want to talk about. So for the Nets to get from 8 to 2, it's going to take a lot. It's going to take 8, multiple other first-round picks, potentially Cam Johnson involved in that. It's going to take a lot. And for a team that doesn't really have much high-end star-level young talent on their roster right now, I think it would be really tough to give up all of what it would take to move up to 2 and get Dylan Harper. And also, I'm not sure that the Spurs are looking to even trade out of that unless they get some ridiculous offer, which I don't think the Nets are going to give them. So I don't think 2 is realistic. I think 3 could be much more of a possibility, because you have a team, the Philadelphia 76ers, that is in a win now mode, with Joel Embiid after just signing Paul George or some of the other guys that they have. And, picking a guy at number 3, whether it be Ace Bailey, VJ Edgecombe, whatever other guy they could potentially have their eye on, picking a 19-year-old who's going to take a few seasons to develop, if you're trying to win right now, might not be the best, way to use that asset. Trading that pick, moving back, getting a win now guy, potentially a Cam Johnson or whoever else you want to say, that could make more sense, still having some draft capital, but also getting a guy who can impact your rotation right now. So I think that could make sense from the 76ers end. From the Nets end, a lot of people, in the draft don't seem to think that there's a huge difference between the guys who are in the 3 to 8 range. Whoever you ever talking about, Ace Bailey, VJ Edgecombe, Jeremiah Fierce, Trey Johnson, Khan Knipple, Kaman Maluak, all those types of guys. the gap from 3 to 8, a lot of people, there's not as much consensus as people thought entering this draft among how you have those players ranked. So it would come down to the Nets evaluations. If they have an extremely high grade on a guy like Ace Bailey or VJ Edgecombe and they want to trade up to 3 to get him, I think they have the assets where they could definitely make an intriguing offer. But as I said, even with 2, the difference in what they would get at that pick, I'm not sure it warrants them giving up a guy like Cam Johnson or giving up 8 and other draft picks, as opposed to just standing pat where they are, getting whoever they can get there, and then using the rest of their picks to try to add numerous, high level young talents to the team. So I definitely think it's possible that they could look to make a move up to 3 and, pique Philadelphia's interest, what they have to offer. I just don't think it's the most likely path right now.
Yeah, it probably would be a big package. Moving up to 3 and 2 for Brooklyn, I think that I agree with you, Eric. If they really love Dylan Harper or Ace Bailey and they want to give up multiple firsts, which is what it would take to move up there, I wouldn't hate it because of how much capital they have. But I think that's only if you love it, 3-0 fastball right down the middle type of thing, where it's got to be perfect for you to do it. Let's play out the scenario where they do stay at 8. They're not intrigued moving up and taking multiple first round picks out of their own hands. They stay at 8. Who are a couple of your top contenders for Brooklyn to snag at that spot?
Yeah, I think it's really the pool of the guys that I just touched on. I think a lot of people think it's safe to say that Ace Bailey and VJ Edgecombe will definitely be off the board by that point. So you're looking at the next tier of prospects beyond that, which could be, Jeremiah Fears, Trey Johnson, Khan Knipple, Kaman Maluak. There's a few guys beyond that. Noah Isenge is a really interesting guy out of France, one of the youngest players in the draft who's still playing right now in Germany and has been having a really intriguing stretch right now. A lot of NBA scouts are high on him. So I think all of those guys could be options. I think they all offer and bring different things to the table. I think a lot of what it's going to come down to, I think the Nets will definitely be prioritizing taking the best player available. They're not going to be drafting for roster fit, given how early they are in their rebuild and how little they have in terms of established players. But I think, are they looking for a guy who has a really high floor and is a safe pick? Are they looking to make a swing? If they're looking to make a swing, a guy like Noah Isenge, a guy like Jeremiah Fears, those are guys who could be home run type picks. If you're looking at guys who are a little bit safer, Khan Knipple, Kaman Maluak, those guys have some concrete skills that they can bring to the table that I think are a little bit less projection based. I think all of them, have things that they bring to the table, concrete skills, but I think all of those guys could be in play. I also think that, there are trade up possibilities from 19 where they could get into the late lottery and look to, get multiple of those guys potentially, depending on how the board shakes out. So I think all of those guys could be in play. I think Jeremiah Fears is a guy that I really like. I've watched a good amount of his tape, and I think he has really intriguing skills as a lead ball handler with star potential, something the Nets haven't had since Kyrie Irving left. But I think there's a decent chance that he might be off the board by 8, whether, it's 5th to the Jazz or 6th to the Washington Wizards. I think there's a lot of teams that could be interested in him. So I think there's a lot of intriguing options. And based on the depth of this draft and some of what I've seen, I'm pretty confident if the Nets stay at 8, they're still going to come away with a very good player.
Sticking with the number 8 talk, the Nets signed Nick Claxton to a 4-year, $100 million deal last offseason, and they have young talent behind him, no doubt about it. Day'Ron Sharpe, Noah Clowney haven't quite developed yet, but they have raw talent. They have an outside chance at the center spot behind him. But 3 really intriguing prospects at 8, Kaman Malawach, Derek Queen, and Colin Murray-Boyles, are probably all going to be there at 8. Could the Nets get even more talent at the center spot this early in the draft?
If they feel that one of those guys is the best player available, I definitely think that they could. Yeah, I don't think that having Nick Claxton, having Day'Ron Sharpe on the roster will in any way influence who they pick. I think that they should be taking the best player available. And if they determine that that is Kaman Maluak or Derek Queen or Colin Murray-Boyles or any of those guys, I think that they will definitely look long and hard at taking them. I think that, in this spot, a lot of the time they might be looking, they might be more intrigued or inclined to take a ball handler type player, just given the NBA, you need high level ball handlers on the team. And right now the Nets have, Cam Thomas as a young ball handler, but there's still a lot of questions about him. So I think a lot of people are hoping probably that they take a ball handler with this top pick because that's just the more exciting pick. But I definitely think that all those centers that you named bring intriguing things to the table where, they have skills that I think could, pique the Nets' interest, obviously. So if those guys are at the top of their board and they're available there at 8, I think that any one of them could definitely be a possibility.
Put out an awesome article this morning that I had the chance to read on Clutch Points regarding Tennessee shooting guard Chaz Lanier, and he visited with the Nets today. Can you tell us anything more about that meeting? And if the Nets were to take him late in the first round, what would he be able to bring to the backcourt?
Yeah, Chaz is a sharp shooting guard out of Tennessee. He was in his 5th year. He played his first 4 years at North Florida and really emerged during a senior season at North Florida as one of the top shooters in all of college basketball. He shot 44% from 3 on over 7 attempts per game. That was, one of the best percentages in the NCAA. And he's the guy that followed up by winning the Jerry West Award this season at Tennessee, which is awarded to the nation's top shooting guard. Shot close to 40% again on over 8 attempts per game. So he's a sharp shooting guy. He's a guy that, has some limitations as a defender, as, a passer, an on-ball creator. But with him, he's going to shoot the hell out of the basketball. He can do it off the move. He can do it from stationary position. So he really offers some of almost like what Cam Johnson can bring offensively in the shooting aspect. Chaz is only 6'4", Cam's 6'8", so they're different in terms of their size and the position they plays. But both of them can move off the ball, can catch from unorthodox positions, and shoot comfortably, off movement. So that really adds a different dimension to their offense, to any offense. And I think that, he's a guy who's been rising up draft board due to the way that he played at Tennessee, due to some of what he did at the combine. He was one of the top testers at the combine in terms of vertical leap, in terms of agility, in terms of straight line speed, the sprint. He was near the top in all of those categories, and he continued to shoot extremely well there. So he's a guy that I think the Nets could definitely look at with maybe, 25 or 26 might be a little bit high there. 26 or 27 might be a little high there, but they also have 36, which I think could be a spot where they could look to target him. And if they do go after him with that pick, they're bringing in a guy who has a concrete skill as an elite shooter, something that Jordi Fernandez obviously has emphasized, that he wants the Nets to get up a lot of threes. And Lanier is a guy who can do it in the half court. He can do it in transition from a lot of different ways. So he's a guy I think a lot of teams will be interested in. And I think the Nets bring him in for a workout, as are, they're bringing in tons of prospects for workouts. But I think that they definitely have some interest in what they saw from him last season.
Absolutely. Just the 3-point shooting that he could bring to this basketball team, I think it could be huge. There were times when the Nets were struggling to scrape the 100-point mark in games, and bringing in a confident 40+ percentage 3-point shooter could be huge to this team. Does it concern you at all, though, that he only emerged in his 4th year and that the development was a little slow?
I think that anytime a prospect is older nowadays, I mean, Chaz is 23 years old, and that's, obviously not a positive. The younger guys have more potential, more room for growth. I think that, that's the reason that you're seeing him, mostly projected as a high or mid-second round pick and not a first round guy. So I think that that can be concerning, obviously, like that limits what you would think would be the ceiling. But I think when you have a guy who can shoot as well as he did, you have a guy who has the athletic tools that he does. He's a little bit undersized. He's only 6'4" at shooting guard. So you'd like to see a guy a little bit bigger at that spot, but he does have good athleticism. He is an elite shooter. So he brings something to the table where if you're looking to pick a guy who could be a role player and stick in the NBA long term, being a dead-eye 3-point shooter, a guy who can shoot off the catch, off the move, do all of those things, it's not a bad skill to have in today's NBA. So I definitely think that his age and, how long it took him to develop should definitely not rule him out. I think teams will take it into consideration. But if you're looking for, a guy at 36 who could stick and be a supporting piece long term, I think he'll definitely be an option there.
Remember, the Nets have 5 total picks, 4 of those coming in the first round. Outside of number 8, which we've touched on a lot today, and outside of Lanier, who are a couple other value guys you'd like to see the Nets grab with their late first picks?
Yeah, I think there's a ton in this draft. I mean, I've really been focusing on the first pick right now in terms of what I've been looking at, in terms of film, in terms of scouting materials, and all those things along those lines. I think there's a few guys, later in the draft who I think could make some sense for them. Thomas Herbert out of Georgetown is a name that I think a lot of people have liked. Liam McNeely, a guy out of UConn, really good shooter, a guy who has some size. This is a really deep draft. Some of the people that I've talked to have said this is the deepest draft that they've covered in 20 plus years. So there's just so many guys to get through at this point. I've really been focusing on the top of the draft at this point. I'm going to get a little bit more into later on, as the weeks progress. But I think that there's a number of guys in the 20s that I think could come away and be impact players for the Nets. It's all going to depend on, what directions do they go with their, early picks and, what are they prioritizing at those positions. But I think later in the draft, there's a bunch of guys who could be really intriguing.
Ladies and gentlemen, Erik Slater. Erik, I can't thank you enough for joining me on the show today. Any final thoughts here before we wrap?
It's an exciting time of year for the Nets. I think Nets fans have obviously been waiting for them to have these kinds of draft assets and this ability to go potentially get a young marquee player for quite some time. They haven't picked in the lottery since 2010. They took Derek Favors third overall. You might not even been alive at that time, Josh. What year were you born?
I was alive. I was very young, though. I was less than a year old.
Well, that shows you how long it's been since the Nets have, picked a guy or had a pick that could potentially turn into a young star level guy. Sean Marks has never picked higher than 20 since he's been here, and he's been the GM since 2016. So having the eighth pick, having, all those other first round picks that they have in a draft that is considered really deep, I think that's really exciting for this team. And with the cap space and the draft assets that they have beyond that, there's a lot of possibilities of the direction as they go. So I'm really excited to provide coverage of that, on Clutch Points on my podcast. I'm really excited to hear moving forward anything that you have to say. And yeah, man, I really appreciate you having me on to talk.
You can find Erik at a writer, beat reporter for the Nets for Clutch Points, and he's also hosting the podcast Believe in Nets. Guys, before we wrap up here, make sure you smash that like button, hit subscribe, share this podcast with all your friends and family. Erik, thank you so much for joining us. You, the listener, thank you so much for tuning in. We will see you on the next one. Peace.